Hi, Christina. Welcome to the Sisterhood.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
I am so pleased you are here. I find you to be an articulate, thoughtful, faithful woman who is taking one step at a time. Here at the Sisterhood, we say that we want to be world changers for good right where we are.
Mm.
And I feel like you do that. You sometimes find yourself in unexpected places, I would think, and unexpected conversations. And I'm excited to kind of dive in today to talk about ideas around truth and where we are in the world right now and how we have good, honest, fruitful conversations with each other.
Mm.
So before we get into that, why don't you tell us a little bit about your family and what a typical day looks like for you right now?
Okay. All right. Well, a typical day for me. A little bit of context. I have 20 years in education. I've taught as a high school English teacher. I have taught as a college professor for the majority of that time, about 15 years of that. PhD in education. So I've always been an educator, mostly English. And right now, my rhythm is a little different than it has been historically. Historically, I am full time in the classroom, and my kids are in school from 8 to 3:30. I've usually been able to finagle a schedule where I can pick them up from school, which is a nice little luxury for a working mom. COVID interrupted a lot of our typical patterns. I would say that was about the time that I was in conversation with Dallas Theological Seminary and transitioning out of Baylor University. And then I'll share a little bit more of my story. But after 2021, the Lord confirmed that a seminary is where I needed to be in this season. So much of my work now at Dallas Theological Seminary as a research associate is done virtually, but I do go up to campus every once in a while for meetings, or if we have somebody that we're hosting on campus, like Tony Evans is coming tomorrow, for example, to speak in chapel, and our center is hosting him. But I do a lot of just theological work on faith integration. We talk about cultural conversations and heart spaces, the church and culture, the church and leadership. So most of my day is spent, I get my kids off to school. I'm working on a Templeton grant proposal with Dallas Theological Seminary and Wheaton and Lifeway, looking at faith of college kids on campus. And meetings, have a lot of meetings, Barna Research or Pew, just different people in that same sphere. Then I pick my kids up from school at 3:30, and my second shift begins, as I'm sure you ladies understand,
Mhm.
having children. Yeah, and so then it's a lot of like running to basketball practice, running to soccer practice, running to the birthday parties, getting dinner ready. I've got to pick up dentist appointment today, pick up groceries at 4. So just a lot of juggling the mom responsibilities as I'm also stewarding what the Lord has given me to do professionally. So
Yeah.
that's kind of my typical day. Yeah.
Well, I think you're so relatable in that you have lots going on. And for our listeners, I think our listeners are very smart women who
Mhm.
also do the dishes. And when I follow you on Instagram and I look at your stories, you're often giving very thoughtful commentary on the world from the carpool pickup line. And
Yeah.
that's where why I feel like for our audience, you kind of fit in that. Now, I stumbled on you. I wasn't looking for you. I stumbled on you a few years ago when you started having some public conversations, maybe not by your choice. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you maybe came into more of a public spotlight outside of Baylor?
Yeah, sure. So, it's interesting because I feel like I had a bit of a public spotlight and a platform for the past few years. I was an assistant professor at California Baptist University. I started working with Christine Cain's A21 organization doing anti-trafficking work, and I was invited to be on the board of Propel Women when it launched. And I remember when I got that invitation, I was honored and I said yes, but I really didn't know what I was saying yes to. And I woke up the next morning, and the website had been launched, and I joked with my husband, I was like the only non-famous person on the board. You know, it was a lot of Christian celebrities, and I think they needed the niche of like, this is just a working mom who loves Jesus, and I fit that niche. And it was, again, an honor to be on the board. But that was, you know, pardon the pun, but it propelled me into a Christian spotlight, and I think that actually helped garner support and rally support after what I then walked through several years later. But because of that platform and that honor, I've been speaking on cultural conversations, women, anti trafficking work, faith integration all along. I think that what happened in 2021 was that what I was speaking on ceased to just be theory and it became actual praxis. I then had to walk out a very hard, difficult public conversation. I wasn't just teaching on it. Again, it wasn't just theoretical. I was actually having to engage this hard public square space with a Christian worldview. So it was actually just this time last year, February of 2021, I essentially criticized the expansion of Title IX, Biden's executive order that now allows biological males to identify as female and occupy female spaces that have historically been protected by Title IX, such as bathrooms, sports, classroom scholarships. At the time when I voiced a dissenting opinion about the expansion of this mandate, really just responding to a like minded colleague, I was one of the few people speaking up about this at the time. I think what has happened in 2021 to raise public awareness and just elevate the conversation, we've had the Summer Olympics in which a biological male competed in female powerlifting and ended up being honored as Sports Illustrated Woman of the Year as a biological male. That was disconcerting. We're seeing with Leah Thomas at University of Penn State, who had historically identified as a male, which is his biological sex, but he has changed his gender identity to identifying as a trans female and is now competing in female spaces. And because we know from Duke University studies that males have a 10 to 15% biological advantage over women in most sports, he is now the number one ranked female swimmer for University of Pennsylvania, and the NCAA just named him, you know, number one champion female swimmer. So I think we're seeing in the public square, we're seeing in public conversations, more discussion about what I was fearful of at the beginning of 2021. So that space doesn't feel nearly as lonely. But initially, when I raised concern, and this is coming from a Christian worldview as a Christian university, as a Christian professor at a Christian university, the response and the backlash was pretty vicious from certain demographics of people. But then the support was also pretty robust as well. And I realized early into that situation that it wasn't really about me at the end of the day, that these are cultural narratives that are clashing. And that brought comfort to just kind of step away and just say, okay, Lord, you be God over this. I'm just going to steward this faithfully. I'm going to walk into spaces you asked me to walk in and speak truth into spaces you asked me to speak truth. But I don't have an agenda, and I have much, much more to lose than I do to gain. So I'm asking for your courage and your perspective as I have these difficult cultural conversations. So yeah, that was the 2021 incident. And then to answer your question, like what was the catalyst into this platform? So I would say in 2021, I probably went from having maybe just under 10,000 followers to, I don't know, like it doubled, I think. People took interest for sure.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned some principles there that I think are translatable to the average woman who may not be a professor, who may not have a public platform, but this idea of I don't have an agenda, and at the same time, I want to steward my relationships well. I want to speak truth in the places and spaces that I'm in. Can you speak to that? Maybe the woman on the street, the average woman who finds herself in conversations where she thinks, okay, I have an opportunity now to speak truth as I know it into this space. How do you encourage her to do that, and with what tone?
Yeah, so there's, a lot to unpack there. I would say foremost, I would want to encourage, men or women, because it's not just women who find themselves in the difficult conversations. Um, I would say that to really just take heart and take bravery, that it's not you people are opposed to, it's the truth that you're speaking. That doesn't negate your responsibility to speak it with compassion, to speak it with nuance, to speak, with a place of empathy, but to realize the moment you make it personal, you have ceased to represent truth, and you've, like potentially ceased to be able to speak truth. This isn't really about, and again, I had to reconcile that in 2021 too, that what people are opposed to is, even if it's not their interpretation of truth, it is my biblical understanding of truth. And I would arguably say it's a biological truth too. So even if it's not biblical for some people, most people were able to rally and support on the biological. So I would say, take heart in knowing that you're speaking truth, that if people are opposed to that, that it is probably not you that they are opposed to, but that it's the truth that you're speaking, to approach it with more humility than hubris, because I do not think that, I mean, we know that the Lord hates pride, that is an absolute, it's abhorrent to him. He detests it. And so I struggle with that, because how do you speak well and speak truth in a way that also is rooted in humility? It's not an easy skill set. And I wouldn't say that I've mastered it at all. If pushed hard enough, all of us can get angry and testy and snarky. Certainly I would say, in retrospect, I mean, all of Twitter is snarky, even. That is
Mhm.
something I've really had to wrestle through, wanting to be a voice of truth and not join in the snark. It's difficult, I'll admit. But I think coming in from a place of just, humility, willing to engage that, willing to stand unwavering in what you know to be true, inviting people, because people are going to be receptive at different places. The same person may be receptive in a different season, even, based on the context of the voices they're listening to, and what they understand to be truth. So to that woman, or to, to the male, I would say to take heart, to know that it's not personal, to know that you're a vessel for truth, and if you're not speaking it, then it leaves one to wonder who's going to. If not you, then who? If they don't receive the truth, if they're not ready to engage it, that's okay. And be willing to have, my mind has been changed on different things, or I have thought more compassionately or more robustly about a myriad of different conversations, the more I think and study and discuss them. um it doesn't change oftentimes. I'm trying to think of a time when I just was absolutely wrong, but I'm certain, like 10, 20 years from now, we'll be studying COVID, and things that we thought were true will be evidence to be untrue. But I think when we're talking in terms of something biblical, that's when I lean into 2,000 years of orthodoxy to understand what I'm purporting to be true. So understanding the source of what you're citing as well is so important.
I just keep thinking of, as you're talking, that as we become more and more and more of the minority voice in culture, it becomes harder to speak up, and it becomes harder because even if we can step back and not be personal in our interaction, often that other person can't be. And so then we feel attacked, and
Yeah.
that doesn't feel good. And I know you've experienced that. And I think some personalities maybe are better at handling that than others. But I just keep going back to this question of, how do we do this when we know that we're going to be attacked? We know that this is not a popular thing to say. Like, let's say we're in that moment and we're
Mhm.
talking about Title IX, and we're in a group where we're like, this is not going to be popular. So even how do you word things? Like, I want to get super practical here. Like, how do you even word something that a little bit disarms the other person so that you just don't become a target?
Yeah. So I'm going to put on, I mean, you guys stop me if this is like getting too nerdy or academic, but I'm going to put on like my actual like professor hat for what I teach when I teach rhetorical writing. And it's funny because, friends and colleagues have laughed and they're like, you teach rhetorical writing and you got in trouble for your rhetoric.
Yeah.
I got in trouble, but it did like ignite a fire. But, and Twitter is not a great place for nuanced conversation. It's just not. And I recognize that. That doesn't mean that we should cease to speak up, but we have to recognize that social media has its limitations, that you cannot always articulate or communicate tone and intent in such a short space. I mean, great rhetorical experts can do this, in shorter spaces. We think of like MLK's "I Have a Dream" speech or his letter to Birmingham jail. Those are relatively short pieces and they communicate such power. But in general, social media is not a great place for nuanced conversation. But to get really practical, so, starting off with like, be willing to have the hard conversations, be brave. I know that different people are in different positions to do that. I sympathize with people who have a lot to lose. They're head of leadership organizations or they're head of, something, and they have just a lot to lose. And we see people get canceled. It's very real. But I would say if you're in a position to use your voice, that is such a precious gift, and don't squander it. So if you're the mom in the carpool line, if you're, the woman in the line at the grocery store, if you're having these conversations and you know that you're not in a position where what you're going to say could potentially cost you your livelihood, then you have a stewardship responsibility to speak up. But very practically and pragmatically, a rhetorical device that works well is asking questions, because it forces people to critically think and reflect on what they believe. It takes you off of the defense. You don't have to be, defensive, and it puts the other person in a position to articulate and, sort of give an apologetics, if you will, for what they believe. So, for example, in 2021, when I said, essentially biological males shouldn't be in biological female spaces, I had a lot of, undergraduate students primarily who are just, immature, and there's grace for that. They haven't had time to really formulate or to think, but they would say things like, well, just get with the times, gender is fluid. And I would ask things like, well, can you help me understand how you got there? And oftentimes they just wouldn't respond. Or I would say, is there new information in biology that would make me think differently? Nothing. But I'm hoping, my heart really and truly is not to pinpoint them into a got you, is to help them start to think reflectively, how did I get into this worldview pattern? How did I become so postmodern that truth is relative and I don't have a grounded basis of evidence here? Or is there some sort of new biblical information that's been interpreted that's leading you to think differently? So very pragmatically, asking questions helps people be reflective. So it takes the responsibility off of you to give a defense or any kind of a dissertation or to be an expert. Like you can really defer and say, I get asked questions about politics all the time where I'm like, I really hardly know what our three branches of government do. Like all I know from Schoolhouse Rock. I can't be the expert on like this new Supreme Court justice. I just don't have time. So instead I'll just say, well, what do you think about the new nominee? Or why do you think she's, a great candidate? Or I just heard recently in the news that she was unable to define what a woman is. And so you would say, well, her inability to define what a woman is, well, what do you think about that for somebody leading our country? So very pragmatically, asking questions is a great way to get sort of like a spiritual GPS on where they are, a GPS on how they, got to that definitive statement. And ultimately and truly, it gives them the gift of reflection. Because if we're only ever allowing people to assert Twitter statements into the universe, then we're not ever forcing people to come to terms with how they got there. And that's a great disservice to all of us, to civil discourse, to critical thinking. So asking questions is a great way to engage those kind of conversations.
Yeah. I feel like it always comes back to asking questions with our teenagers and it's true, because why don't we do it more? Why is it that it's almost like in that moment we forget And so just even that idea that don't forget, ask the question. You don't need to tell,
Yeah.
ask instead.
Yeah.
So one of the things you mentioned was this idea of truth.
Mm.
And we actually in our last in our series 2 times ago, we were doing a series about parenting boys, and we had an expert on talking about Gen Z, and just that one of their quests is the quest for truth, because everyone's truth is fluid. Everyone's truth is personal, and truth is to you what truth is to you, and truth is to me what truth is to me.
Mhm.
I would love your take on how do we discern truth, and how do we talk about truth when there seems to be no truth?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the first place to start is that there is a discernible difference between like capital T biblical truth and small t truth. So when we're talking about truth, are we talking about like societal norms, or that it is generally, lowercase t true that females will gravitate towards things that are societally deemed feminine, and that males will gravitate towards things that are more masculine. So I mean, like there's research to prove that little boys will gravitate towards picking up the truck 9 out of 10 times, and little girls will gravitate towards the doll. So we're biologically wired to crave these things, to want these things. But again, I would say that that's like, it's a little t truth, because there is nothing in scripture that definitively says, and thou shalt play with trucks if you're a boy, and thou shalt play with dolls if you're a girl. And so I think that we don't want to ever make the little t truth the capital T. Like, we know that as believers, the only way to heaven is through Jesus. I mean, scripture is clear on that. We know that God has created us for a purpose and for design, and that we have distinctly different roles. And this gets into, like, again, that complementarian egalitarian argument, which wherever people land is fine. But again, I would say, let's not lose sight of the big T truth, that we all carry the image of God, that we're created for a purpose, that He has given us a life to steward unto His glory. And then it gets into the lowercase t truths after that. So discerning the difference on what is a capital T truth worth fighting for, and what is a lowercase, T truth. And that doesn't mean that it's not still important, because the lowercase has deep ramifications and implications. So for example, Leah Thomas coming into female lanes has deep ramifications for the women on the University of Pennsylvania swim team. So it's not that we relegate those to so secondary that we don't nuance them out and have conversation. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I'm saying we've already lost, if we have lost sight of what matters for an eternal kingdom perspective, and what is a hill not worth dying on. And then for me personally, well, not even just me personally. I mean, this is research-based evidence. I need to be able to point to sources. So when people say, well, that's my truth and that can be your truth, well, one of us has to be wrong. Maybe there is a common ground place that we can meet in the middle, but oftentimes, either, I'm trying to think of something like relevant, like, even I was going to say, masks are working or they're not, but that's nuanced, like, I just would need to see the data on that, or the vaccinations. It's really not like either they're working or they're not. Can I see the data on that? So I think with a lot of things, we want to be able to point to research and to data. That's difficult because not all things have research and data, but that's when I lean into the wisdom of experts. And probably Alex can attest from following me on social media. It's so concerning to me how many voices are becoming expert on, like, church deconstruction or walking away. And I keep asking the question, on what authority do you have to speak on this? If you don't have actual, like, research that you can point to, or you don't have anything robust that you can point to as your touchstone, then I at least need to know with what authority and credibility you are speaking on this topic. And I think it's part of the social media, world that we live in. I live in a world of higher ed where your expertise matters, and your credentials matter, and your research matters. And I know that that's not everybody's world, but I would just encourage people to at least still look at the person who is speaking and ask yourself, like, what is their authority? who's holding them accountable, what is the fruit from their life. Just even yesterday, I was following an account I was engaging with that is, I won't say their name, but their goal really is to lead people out of church, to make the point that the church doesn't have to take place within the four walls. I mean, it's part of their mission statement, which feels like a very bleak purpose for an organization. But and so I was asking this person, like, have you gone to seminary? Like, have you led a church? Like, just very practical questions. And I mean, the answer to all of them were no. And so I'm asking myself, why would I listen to your voice? I'm seeing the fruit and it looks pretty destructive, or to use a popular word, toxic. And I'm not seeing evidence that, this is leading to health in your life. I'm not seeing evidence that you have authority on this. I think we just have to pause and ask ourselves, why then are we listening to certain voices? Like, what is the fruit? What's the authority? What's the motive behind it? We've lost, I think, that reflective process. So I don't know if that answers the question on how do we discern truth, but I think it does certainly start with asking, where are they getting this information? Let them prove, again, kind of asking the question, like, where are you getting your truth? Your internal compass is broken without the Lord, or at the very least without data, right? So, you know, again, like asking people, well, where do you get your truth? How do you arrive at that truth?
And I would say right now, a lot of people are saying, well, it's my lived experience. And so that should be enough. And so we want to honor people, right? We want to honor people's lived experience. And people's lived experience doesn't always spell out what is generally true. I liked the little t, like this tends to be true. And sometimes there are exceptions to that, versus the big T. I think that's really helpful to kind of mentally weed through what is really important here. And so as we enter those conversations, I wonder if we lead with the big truth, big T truth of, this person is made in God's image, and I'm going to honor them with my tone, with my disposition, with the way that I treat them. And if we disagree on either the big T or the little t truth, I am still beholden to God to honor my fellow person with respect. And that's where it gets a little tough. And I feel like you do a really good job of that, Christina. I feel like you definitely tell your opinion. And I think you do it in a way that's respectful and points out your sources and asks questions. So I really do feel like you model what you're saying here. So I encourage people to follow you to see it modeled out. And they may not agree with you on where you land on everything, but the way that you do it, I think, is brings some civility to the conversation.
Well, thank you, Alex. I mean, again, I'm trying to ask myself some reflective questions as I sit here. And I think for me, and I don't know if this would translate and transfer to everybody, but I really have had to learn not to take it personally. And I'm not perfect at this, but I think just years of being in the classroom with students, high school and college students who say and think some wacky things. They just do, you know. And just asking them, like, just trying to hear them out and to listen with the compassion of a professor and a mother's heart, and to ask them to defend it, and to realize at the end of the day, if they can't defend what they believe, no way am I jumping on that bandwagon. And also to kind of elevate this to the macro level, that there are spiritual forces, that our fight is not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities of darkness. So I try to remember, when someone believes something so far off the touchstone of truth, that it's really a darkness, a guise that is blinding them to seeing the truth. But even keeping that perspective of, like, I'm sure there are places in my life where I'm missing that as well, like approaching it with that humility. It's not as if I have my theology nicely tied in a bow in every area of life. Like, I just got off a call before this the conversation about dispensationalism and the 7 stages. And I was like, wait, what? Like, I'm in above my head. And so there are places where I have to, again, defer to the experts. We talked about lived experience, but lived experience can be tricky. We don't want to negate someone's experience. Like, I really lived a childhood through divorce and through a mom who was a single mom. Like, that is a very real and lived experience. But I also have to remember that it's case study of one, and what happened to me is not always transferable or generalizable or true. So I think just keeping that perspective of knowing that, like, your lived experience matters, but it can't triumph over fact. Feelings matter. They do. In fact, in writing, it's called pathos. So pathos, ethos, and logos. So the ethos is your credibility, your expertise on this. The pathos is, the feeling, the emotion that's evoked. And then the logos is the truth, the word, the evidence. And so it all very much matters, and it's all very much persuasive, but we can't isolate one kind of rhetorical strategy or approach to conversation or to thinking, or we're missing the triune of kind of thought here. Yeah, so I don't know. I think I try not to take it personally. The only time I ever do, I've gotten defensive when some people threatened my kids. That brought out the mama bear in me real fast. And then I do sometimes get defensive on behalf of the Big C church, because I very much believe she's the bride of Christ. So it's not that I don't think she needs accountability, because she does. But just like I would never throw my spouse under the bus or slander him or publicly drag him through the public square, I'm not going to do that to the bridegroom either, or to the bride of Christ. So that is a place where I do get a little bit defensive. But again, just kind of like all things in balance, remembering this isn't really about me. This is about the principalities of darkness and the spiritual battle at the macro level. And that just helps keep perspective, I think, for me.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I love you talking about those 3 different pieces. That's really helpful. And I think it's something we can even evaluate our own perspectives by, am I grounded in these 3 things? So thank you for that. That's a good handhold.
Yeah.
Christina, as we end today, what would you say to the person who maybe has felt discouraged about being a part of this moment in time? And yet, for each of us, for such a time as this, right? That actually, if we flip that, we can actually say, no, we're actually meant to be here in this place, in this time in history. So how can you just offer some hope to people who are feeling like they really don't have hope right now in culture?
Yeah. I would say that this is actually something that I struggle with as well, because what's hard for me is, I'll give an example. So we're having a lot of these conversations at the national level and kind of public square about Christian nationalism, which is egregious and abhorrent, and it's a very concerning narrative and practice. And I agree with that. But I keep asking these authors and researchers on this that I'm social media friends with, okay, how then do we teach people to engage their faith in public policy in a way that is authentic and doesn't negate their worldview, but is still pluralistic enough for a democracy? And usually the conversation becomes stagnant, because I think that even the experts are wrestling through that. Historically, we've had a shared foundation of a Judeo-Christian worldview, and it made it easier for us to find common ground. 20 years ago, we weren't as culturally confused about the discernible differences, the immutable differences between being biologically male and being biologically female. 50 years ago, we had a more clear definition, right or wrong, on, biblically speaking, right, but, pluralistic society, on what constitutes marriage and who has the right to marriage. And so I think that navigating between a Christian worldview and an American democracy, pluralistic worldview is tricky because historically they've been closer aligned. Now they are further from each other than they really have ever been. And so we're trying to grapple with what then does that look like to engage my faith. If I'm a unapologetically Christian politician, and it is up to me to decide an abortion bill or how we're going to integrate racial reconciliation to the classroom. Is it critical race theory? Is it not? Well, what does that mean for giving LGBTQ identifying kids protection, but not so much protection that parents are unclear? These are very real conversations. And because we don't have enough of the same spiritual compass and common ground that we once had, they're trickier than ever. And so I don't know that I have like a solution, but it helps to look at that macro picture and to say, like, how did we get here? We honestly got here because we lost a shared common ground in a Judeo-Christian belief system. Now, is the answer to then force that? I don't think so. I don't think that's historically worked. It hasn't worked for the UK, and we're only 10 to 20 years behind them on all social trends, have been since the establishment of our country. So that they're always a good case study of like, what did they do with LGBTQ? What have they done with pedophilers who want to identify as a minor attracted person? That's how they would like to be identified now. So it's like, well, what are they doing? So that's always a good place to look for a sociological trend. But on a very pragmatic level, I think just keeping in mind that this is right in line with what scripture tells us, that we're not living anything that scripture hasn't warned us. It helps me to remember that human nature doesn't change. That if you read scripture and you apply it, that lens of historical hermeneutics to a present day, it's amazing how applicable it still is because human nature doesn't change. The only thing that I ever kind of joke with people is like that has changed is social media. So our ability to communicate in real time our thoughts, that is new. That has never happened before in all of human history. So what that's doing to humanity will be an ongoing, fascinating discussion. But human nature itself, what we're feeling, what we're wrestling through, cultural issues, even helping my second grader last week with his Egyptian project, we're talking about polytheism and monotheism. And so the idea of having multiple gods and multiple idols, we've just replaced our multiple gods and multiple idols, even with like self-love and personal truth, so we've just renamed all of our gods and goddesses and given them different idols and different statues, but human nature hasn't changed. And that, again, that just kind of helps me bring it back to like a place of biblical clarity. It doesn't mean we give up. It doesn't mean we retreat. That would, again, not be good stewardship of what the Lord has asked us to do, which is to, look at all he has made that has been fallen and broken by the enemy and to redeem and restore it unto his glory. That's the biblical mandate. But I think we just cannot get lost. And, culture is broken. And that is why we get to partner and collaborate with God to redeem and restore it. And so there can be, I struggle with this, but there can be a really exciting place of like, look, Lord, how much they need to hear about you more than ever. I have to kind of cheer myself and pump myself up for that too, though, if I'm honest.
We all do.
Yeah.
We all do.
Yeah, which is why we're having this conversation, because we want to cheer each other on to say, you can speak truth in the world. And in fact, God wants you to. And what that means and where you land on a particular thing in a conversation, how you ask those questions, those are going to be dependent on you and your relationship with God and your relationship with the other person. Yeah. So we're not telling you how to do anything in a concrete, you must do it this way. We are saying, though, that God is inviting you into his process to make all things new and to usher his kingdom in here on earth. And Christina, I think you do it so beautifully and really represent so many of us well in, I often am like, yeah, what she said. So just the way that you are able to articulate some questions and say, this is what I'm wrestling with right now. When I hear this headline, these are the questions that come to mind. And I think that's okay. We should have the freedom to say that. When I hear this, these are the questions or the red flags or the alarms in my head that go off because of how I read about who God is in Scripture and about how he operates in the world and about who we are in relationship to him. So thank you very much. Thanks for your encouragement today and your encouragement every day on Instagram. Hello, people. Follow her.
All right. Bye, Christina.
Bye. Thanks for having me, ladies. I appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.